Weddings are supposed to be joyful, emotional, and familiar. But if you could step back into the ancient world and attend a wedding there, much of what you would see would feel confusing, uncomfortable, and sometimes almost unbelievable. Customs that once made perfect sense now sound like exaggerations or myths. Yet every one of them was real, meaningful, and taken seriously by the people who practiced them. Ancient wedding traditions were not designed to entertain guests or express romance in the modern sense. They were about survival, family structure, property, community stability, and social order. Marriage was not just a personal moment. It was a public transformation that reshaped lives permanently. Because of that, rituals became intense, symbolic, and sometimes deeply strange to modern eyes. In this video, we will explore the strangest ancient wedding traditions from different parts of the world, uncovering why they existed, what they meant to the people involved, and how they reflected the realities of ancient life. Some of these customs may shock you, others may feel unsettling, but all of them reveal how differently ancient societies understood marriage, identity, and belonging. If you enjoy deep, story-driven history that keeps you hooked from start to finish, like this video, subscribe for more long-form history, and leave a comment telling us which tradition surprised you the most. Now, let's begin at the very start, where ancient weddings truly differed from ours. In the ancient world, a wedding was not a celebration of romance. It was a public transformation that altered identity, ownership, loyalty, and social position in a single moment. This is the first reason ancient wedding traditions feel so strange today. Marriage was not primarily about love. It was about survival, continuity, and order. Everything else, emotion, affection, personal preference, came later, if at all. To modern eyes, a wedding is a beginning chosen by two individuals. In ancient societies, it was an event managed by families and communities, designed to stabilize the future. Because the stakes were so high, the rituals surrounding marriage were intense, symbolic, and often unsettling. These traditions were not random. Each one solved a problem that ancient people faced daily. One of the strangest features of ancient weddings was how little the couple themselves often mattered during the ceremony. In many societies, the individuals being married played a passive role. Decisions were made long before the wedding day. The ceremony existed to announce a change, not to negotiate it. By the time the ritual began, the outcome was already fixed. This explains why many ancient wedding traditions focused less on joy and more on control. Weddings marked the transfer of a person, usually a woman, from one household to another. This transfer had to be clear, visible, and irreversible. Ambiguity caused disputes. Disputes threatened stability. Ritual removed doubt. In some ancient cultures, weddings deliberately created emotional tension rather than happiness. The transition from one family to another was meant to feel serious, even uncomfortable. A calm, effortless wedding would have failed to communicate the weight of the change. Strange customs existed to make the moment unforgettable. One such custom was the deliberate separation ritual. Before the wedding, the bride was often isolated from familiar surroundings. She might be dressed in unfamiliar clothing, kept away from friends, or placed under the supervision of older women. This separation was not symbolic decoration. It was psychological preparation. The old identity had to weaken before the new one could form. Ancient people understood that identity was shaped by environment. Removing someone from familiar space made transformation easier. The discomfort was intentional. Another strange tradition involved public observation. Ancient weddings were rarely private. The more people witnessed the ceremony, the stronger its authority. Community presence acted as enforcement. Everyone saw the change. Everyone remembered it. Everyone became a witness. This is why some ancient weddings involved processions through the streets. The couple was displayed publicly, sometimes in exaggerated or unfamiliar clothing. This visual disruption signaled that something permanent was happening. The couple was no longer ordinary. In several ancient societies, weddings included ritualized resistance. The bride might appear hesitant. She might be symbolically pulled or guided rather than walking freely. To modern viewers, this feels disturbing. In ancient context, it served a specific purpose. It demonstrated that the transition was difficult, not casual. A marriage that appeared too eager could imply weakness or lack of value. Resistance showed that the bride was not easily given away. It reinforced the seriousness of the exchange between families. Another tradition that feels strange today is the use of noise and chaos during weddings. Shouting, singing, clapping, and exaggerated movement were common. These were not celebrations in the modern sense. Noise was believed to mark boundaries. It disrupted normal time. It announced transformation. Silence belonged to ordinary days. Noise belonged to moments of change. Some ancient weddings deliberately included confusion. The order of events might feel illogical. The couple might move between spaces repeatedly. Objects were exchanged, removed, and returned. This confusion was not a mistake. It reflected the belief that transitions were unstable moments when normal rules temporarily loosened. Only after the ritual ended did order return, now with new roles firmly in place. Food played a strange role as well. In some cultures, the wedding meal was not about abundance, but about restriction. Certain foods were withheld. Portions were controlled. Eating followed strict rules. This restraint emphasized discipline and the seriousness of the bond. Marriage was not about indulgence. It was about responsibility. Another unfamiliar custom involved testing endurance. Weddings could last for hours or days, exhausting the participants. Fatigue was not a side effect. It was part of the process. Physical exhaustion reduced resistance and sharpened memory. A person remembered a tiring event more clearly than an easy one. Ancient people understood this intuitively. Clothing at ancient weddings was also often strange by modern standards. Rather than highlighting beauty, garments emphasized status and transition. Colors, layers, and accessories marked the individual as being between identities. The bride might look intentionally unfamiliar. This visual strangeness reinforced the idea that the person was no longer who they had been, but not yet who they would become. In some cultures, the wedding involved temporary loss of personal freedom. The bride or groom might be closely supervised, guided in movement, or restricted in speech. This was not punishment. It symbolized surrender to a new structure. Marriage reduced individual autonomy in exchange for protection and belonging. Ancient societies valued order over expression. Weddings reflected that priority. Another strange aspect was the role of elder women. In many ancient weddings, older women controlled preparation, timing, and ritual actions. This was not coincidence. They had lived through the transition themselves. Their authority came from experience, not hierarchy. These women acted as guardians of continuity. They ensured the ritual was performed correctly so the marriage would be recognized as valid by the community. Ancient weddings also often included symbolic imbalance. One person was emphasized more than the other. This reflected social reality, not fairness. Marriage formalized roles that already existed. The ritual made hierarchy visible. To modern viewers, this feels uncomfortable. To ancient societies, it felt honest. Perhaps the strangest thing of all is how little ancient weddings focused on the future happiness of the couple. The concern was not whether they would be content, but whether the union would function. A functioning marriage meant stability. Stability meant survival. Love, when it existed, was expected to grow later. This is why ancient wedding traditions feel alien today. They were designed for a world where individual choice was limited, resources were scarce, and communities depended on predictability. Marriage was infrastructure, not expression. Every strange custom, from isolation to noise, from resistance to exhaustion, served a purpose. These traditions shaped behavior, memory, and acceptance. They ensured that once the wedding ended, there was no confusion about what had changed. Ancient weddings were not gentle beginnings. They were controlled crossings from one state of life to another. And this is only the beginning. One of the most unsettling aspects of ancient wedding traditions was how deliberately they altered appearance. In many societies, a wedding was not just a legal or social change. It was a visible rewriting of identity. On the wedding day, the bride or groom often looked nothing like their everyday self. This transformation was intentional. Familiarity was dangerous. Familiarity invited doubt. If a person looked the same, spoke the same, and behaved the same, then how could the community truly believe that anything had changed? Ancient societies solved this problem through disguise, exaggeration, and visual disruption. Weddings were moments when normal appearance rules were suspended. The body became a symbol, and symbols were allowed to be extreme. In many ancient cultures, the bride was deliberately made to look unrecognizable. Hair was styled in unfamiliar ways, sometimes hidden entirely. The face might be partially covered. Clothing layers obscured the body's natural shape. Jewelry was heavy, awkward, and sometimes uncomfortable. None of this was accidental. The goal was not beauty in the modern sense. The goal was separation from the past self. Ancient people believed that identity was reinforced through repetition. You were who you looked like every day. By disrupting that appearance at the moment of marriage, the old identity weakened. The bride was no longer fully herself, but not yet fully part of the new household. She existed in between. This in-between state was considered powerful and unstable. Because of that, it had to be carefully controlled. Another strange custom involved intentional concealment. In some societies, the bride's face was hidden until the final stages of the wedding. This was not about modesty as we understand it today. It was about suspense and authority. The moment of reveal marked the completion of the transition. Until then, the person remained symbolically unfinished. Concealment also prevented hesitation. Once revealed, the transformation was complete. The community witnessed it together. There was no quiet reversal. In contrast, some cultures did the opposite. They exaggerated visibility. Brides were dressed in unusually bright or contrasting colors, sometimes intentionally clashing with local fashion. The goal was not harmony. It was announcement. This person was no longer ordinary. Their presence demanded attention. Color carried meaning. Certain shades were reserved for transition moments only. Wearing them outside of marriage would have felt inappropriate. This visual language told everyone, instantly, that a social boundary was being crossed. Hair played a particularly powerful role. Hair symbolized personal identity and continuity. Cutting it, covering it, or rearranging it signaled loss and renewal. In some ancient weddings, hair was styled by others for the first time. This surrender of control was symbolic. The individual no longer shaped their own appearance alone. This can feel deeply uncomfortable to modern audiences, but in ancient context, it was logical. Marriage reduced personal independence. The ritual reflected that truth. Another strange tradition was the use of intentional discomfort in clothing. Heavy garments, tight bindings, or awkward accessories made movement difficult. This physical restriction was symbolic. It reminded the individual that life after marriage would involve constraint, responsibility, and adjustment. A wedding that felt too easy was seen as unrealistic. Ancient societies also used masking, sometimes literal, sometimes symbolic. Faces might be partially obscured or expressions controlled. Speech could be limited. The individual became less of a person and more of a role during the ceremony. This was not dehumanization in the modern sense. It was role creation. The personal self stepped back so the social self could emerge. In some cultures, the groom also underwent transformation, though often less extreme. He might wear unfamiliar clothing, carry symbolic objects, or be positioned differently in public space. These changes reinforced new responsibilities rather than loss of autonomy. Still, the imbalance was clear. Most ancient wedding appearance rituals focused on the bride because she experienced the most dramatic social relocation. Her transformation had to be unmistakable. Another unsettling practice was temporary renaming. During the wedding, the bride might not be called by her personal name. She was referred to by titles or relational terms instead. This linguistic shift reinforced visual change. Names carried identity. Removing them weakened attachment to the past. Even after the wedding, it could take time before the new name or title fully replaced the old one. This gradual shift mirrored the psychological adjustment process. Ancient weddings also used objects to complete transformation. Belts, shoes, veils, or tokens were placed on the body at specific moments. Each placement marked a step forward. Removing or receiving an item signaled irreversible change. These objects were not decorative. They were functional symbols. Without them, the transition was incomplete. One of the strangest practices involved intentional contrast between before and after. The bride might be dressed plainly before the ceremony and elaborately afterward, or vice versa. This contrast made the change visually undeniable. Anyone who saw her before and after could not mistake the difference. Memory mattered. The clearer the contrast, the stronger the collective memory. Ancient people understood that social stability depended on shared perception. Everyone had to agree that the person had changed. Appearance made agreement automatic. This focus on transformation explains why ancient weddings often feel theatrical to modern viewers. They were theatrical by necessity. When you cannot rely on documents, records, or systems, You rely on sight. Another unusual element was controlled movement. Brides might be guided, turned, paused, or repositioned deliberately. Each movement carried meaning. Standing in certain places marked authority or submission. Crossing thresholds symbolized departure from one life and entry into another. Movement replaced paperwork. Ancient weddings were full of moments that would feel excessive or uncomfortable today, but every one of them reinforced certainty. Once the ritual ended, there was no ambiguity. The person who emerged was not the same one who entered. This is what modern weddings often lack. They celebrate emotion, but ancient weddings enforced transformation. The strangeness we feel comes from the fact that ancient societies prioritized function over feeling. Appearance was not self-expression. It was social architecture. When we strip away modern expectations, these traditions stop looking random. They become precise tools designed to reshape identity in a world where marriage determines survival. Among the strangest ancient wedding traditions were those that deliberately introduced discomfort, public pressure, and testing into what we now expect to be a joyful moment. To modern audiences, these customs can feel harsh or humiliating, but in the ancient world, they served a clear purpose. Marriage was not judged by how it felt on the wedding day. It was judged by whether it would hold under pressure. Because of that, many cultures believed the wedding itself should include controlled difficulty. Ancient societies did not assume that stability came naturally. They believed it had to be proven. One of the most common and most misunderstood features of ancient weddings was the idea that the bride or groom must demonstrate endurance. This endurance was not about strength in a physical sense, but about composure, patience, and obedience to ritual. Weddings often lasted for many hours or even several days. Participants were expected to remain attentive, alert, and compliant throughout. Fatigue was not a mistake. It was intentional. Ancient people understood something modern psychology would later confirm. Exhaustion lowers resistance. When the body is tired, the mind becomes more accepting. A long, demanding ceremony reduced the likelihood of hesitation, argument, or second thoughts. By the end of the ritual, the transition felt inevitable. Another strange tradition involved public scrutiny. The couple, especially the bride, was often observed closely by elders, relatives, and sometimes the entire community. Behavior, posture, and reaction were noticed. Calm acceptance was valued. Excess emotion, whether excitement or distress, was often discouraged. This may feel cold to modern sensibilities, but ancient societies prioritized predictability. A person who could maintain composure under attention was seen as reliable. Reliability mattered more than expressiveness. In some cultures, weddings included moments of intentional embarrassment. These were not random insults, but carefully structured situations designed to strip away personal pride. The individual was reminded that marriage meant subordination to collective expectations. Personal ego had to shrink so the role could expand. Embarrassment served as a social reset. It placed everyone on equal footing before entering a new hierarchy. Another unsettling custom was public instruction during the ceremony. Elders might speak directly to the bride or groom, reminding them of duties and expectations in front of witnesses. This was not private advice. It was a public declaration that the individual was now accountable. Public accountability was essential in societies without written contracts. Words spoken before witnesses carried weight. The discomfort of public instruction reinforced seriousness. Some ancient weddings included symbolic tasks performed during the ceremony. These tasks were not meant to be impressive. They were meant to demonstrate willingness to perform routine, sometimes tedious duties. Completing a simple but repetitive action calmly showed readiness for daily responsibility. Marriage was not romanticized as excitement. It was understood as repetition. In certain traditions, the bride was required to remain silent for extended periods. Silence was not oppression for its own sake. It symbolized listening, restraint, and transition. Speaking freely belonged to the old identity. Silence marked entry into a new role. Ancient societies valued controlled speech. A person who could remain quiet under pressure was considered disciplined. Another strange practice involved delayed reward. Celebratory elements, music, food, rest, were sometimes withheld until the very end of the ceremony. This reinforced the idea that pleasure followed duty, not the other way around. Only after obligations were fulfilled did relief arrive. This structure mirrored everyday life. Survival came first. Enjoyment came second. Some weddings included tests of attention. The couple might be required to remember sequences, respond to cues, or perform actions at precise moments. Failure caused repetition. This was not cruelty. It ensured focus. Marriage required attentiveness, and the ritual reflected that expectation. Ancient people believed that how someone behaved during a ritual predicted how they would behave afterward. Another custom that feels strange today is the involvement of mock challenges posed by relatives or community members. These were not real obstacles, but symbolic ones. The purpose was to demonstrate commitment in the face of social resistance. Overcoming these challenges publicly reinforced legitimacy. Once the community had tested and accepted the union, it became harder to question later. Ancient weddings also often involved controlled waiting. The bride or groom might be kept standing, seated, or positioned for long periods without explanation. Waiting tested patience and obedience. It also emphasized that the individual no longer controlled time during this transition. Time belonged to the ritual, not the person. Another uncomfortable element was the use of ritual awkwardness. The couple might be required to perform actions that felt unnatural or clumsy. This disrupted normal social grace. By breaking routine behavior, the ritual marked the moment as outside ordinary life. Awkwardness made the event memorable. Memory mattered. In some societies, laughter from observers was allowed or even encouraged during certain moments. This was not mockery. It served to dissolve individual self-importance. Marriage reduced personal centrality in favor of collective structure. The community reminded the individual, "You are part of something larger now." What modern viewers often interpret as humiliation was, in ancient context, equalization. Everyone who married passed through similar discomfort. Shared experience created solidarity. No one entered marriage untouched by ritual pressure. It is important to emphasize that these customs were bounded. They followed strict rules. They were not arbitrary. The discomfort ended when the ritual ended. Once the transition was complete, the individual's new status was recognized and protected. Ancient societies did not intend to break people. They intended to reshape them. These traditions also served as proof of legitimacy. A marriage that had endured the full ritual could not easily be denied. Anyone who questioned it could be reminded. Everyone saw it happen. Everyone witnessed the tests. This mattered in a world without centralized enforcement. Perhaps the most striking difference between ancient and modern weddings is that ancient rituals did not attempt to hide difficulty. They acknowledged openly that marriage involved strain, adjustment, and loss of autonomy. Rather than pretending otherwise, they confronted it directly. This honesty feels shocking today because modern weddings emphasize optimism. Ancient weddings emphasize preparedness. The strange customs of testing, discomfort, and public pressure were not expressions of cruelty. They were expressions of realism. Ancient people believed that beginning a marriage without acknowledging hardship was dangerous, and so they built hardship into the beginning itself. One of the most difficult aspects of ancient wedding traditions for modern audiences to accept is the way marriage was treated as a formal exchange. This exchange was not hidden or softened. It was made visible through ritual, objects, movement, and public acknowledgement. To ancient societies, marriage reorganized responsibility, labor, loyalty, and inheritance. If that reorganization was not made unmistakably clear, confusion would follow, and confusion threatened stability. Because of this, many ancient wedding traditions centered on transfer. Someone changed households. Something changed ownership. A set of obligations moved from one group to another. These changes were not symbolic metaphors. They were practical realities, and the rituals surrounding them were designed to make those realities undeniable. One of the strangest features of ancient weddings was the deliberate physical relocation of the bride. This was not a quiet or private act. In many cultures, the bride was moved publicly from her family's space to her new household. This movement could involve a procession, a guided walk, or a carefully staged arrival. The journey itself mattered more than the destination. Movement marked transition. Standing still implied continuity. By physically relocating the bride in front of witnesses, the community acknowledged that her daily life, authority, and obligations were changing. Once the movement was complete, reversal became socially difficult. Ancient people understood something modern societies often avoid. Where a person sleeps and eats determines who they belong to. Marriage changed that location, and ritual made the change visible. Objects played a central role in this process. Ancient weddings often involved the exchange of items that represented responsibility rather than wealth. Tools, household items, clothing, or keys were passed between families. These objects were not gifts in the modern sense. They were signals. Receiving them meant accepting a role. Giving them away meant releasing authority. Another unfamiliar custom was the public acknowledgement of contribution. In some traditions, items brought by the bride were displayed or listed. This was not meant to show off. It clarified what resources entered the new household and under whose responsibility they now fell. Transparency prevented later disputes. In a world without contracts, ritual functioned as record-keeping. Ancient weddings also made use of threshold rituals. The bride did not simply enter her new home. She paused, waited, or performed specific actions at the entrance. Thresholds were seen as unstable spaces, neither inside nor outside. Crossing them without ritual was considered incomplete. This pause reinforced the seriousness of the moment. Once the threshold was crossed properly, the new status was accepted by the household and the wider community. Another strange custom involved controlled access. During certain parts of the ceremony, the bride might not be allowed to move freely. She was guided, positioned, or instructed. This was not accidental. It symbolized the temporary suspension of personal autonomy during transition. Ancient societies believed that transitions required structure. Freedom returned after the new role settled. Food exchange was another deeply symbolic and often misunderstood element. Sharing food between families marked acceptance. But the sequence mattered. Who ate first, who served, and who waited communicated hierarchy and responsibility. These rules were not about manners. They were about order. Eating together sealed the exchange. Refusing food, even symbolically, could signal rejection of the union. Some ancient weddings involved ritual handling of household spaces. The bride might touch specific objects, sit in designated places, or perform simple domestic actions. These actions marked her formal integration into the daily functioning of the household. To modern eyes, this can feel reductive. To ancient societies, it was practical. Marriage was not about symbolism alone. It was about who would do what tomorrow morning. Another unsettling practice was the temporary exclusion of the bride's birth family after the exchange. Once the transfer was complete, immediate return or interference was discouraged. This reinforced the finality of the change. Divided loyalty created instability. Ancient societies prioritized clarity over comfort. This does not mean that families stopped caring. It means that care was reorganized. The wedding ritual enforced that reorganization publicly so that expectations aligned. Some traditions emphasized this separation through symbolic distance. The bride's former household might be physically closed off during the ceremony. Doors were shut. Paths were blocked. These gestures communicated closure. Closure mattered as much as opening. Another strange element was the role of witness objects. Certain items used in the ceremony were preserved afterward, not for sentiment, but as proof. Their continued existence reminded everyone that the exchange had occurred. They functioned as memory anchors. Without written records, memory required reinforcement. Ancient weddings also formalized responsibility transfer through speech. Specific phrases were spoken aloud, sometimes repeated, sometimes echoed by witnesses. These words were not poetic. They were functional. They clarified duty, protection, and obligation. Words spoken once could fade. Words spoken repeatedly before witnesses endured. In some cultures, the groom or his household formally accepted responsibility for the bride's well-being. This acceptance was public and binding. It was not assumed. It had to be stated. This mattered because marriage altered vulnerability. The ritual ensured that protection followed transfer. Another uncomfortable aspect was the asymmetry of exchange. Often, one side gave more than the other. This imbalance reflected social structure. Ancient weddings did not pretend to be equal exchanges. They reflected reality. Modern discomfort comes from projecting modern ideals backward. Ancient societies believed that pretending balance existed when it did not was dangerous. Ritual exposed imbalance rather than hiding it. The exchange-focused nature of ancient weddings explains why they can feel transactional today. They were transactional because survival depended on clear transactions. Ambiguity caused conflict. Conflict threatened the group. These rituals were not designed to diminish individuals. They were designed to stabilize systems. When modern audiences encounter these traditions, they often ask whether ancient people felt reduced to objects. The historical evidence suggests something different. People understood these rituals as necessary frameworks. They did not expect weddings to affirm individuality. They expected them to secure life. Love, when it existed, developed inside that structure, not instead of it. Ancient weddings made one thing clear above all else. Marriage was not a private agreement. It was a public reorganization of responsibility. The rituals existed to ensure that everyone, families, neighbors, elders, shared the same understanding. Once that understanding was established, life could continue with fewer disputes. In the ancient world, marriage was rarely a single moment. It was a long, unfolding transformation, intentionally stretched across time so that no one, neither the couple, nor their families, nor the wider community, could mistake what was happening. This is one of the strangest aspects of ancient wedding traditions to modern eyes, because today we expect clarity, completion, and closure in one decisive day. Ancient societies distrusted that kind of speed. To them, fast change was unstable change, and instability was dangerous. Marriage reorganized nearly every aspect of daily life. It changed where a person lived, who they obeyed, how labor was divided, how property moved, and how future children would be claimed and supported. These were not abstract concerns. A mistaken marriage could leave people without protection, without resources, or without belonging. Because of this, ancient societies built delay directly into the wedding itself, not as hesitation, but as a form of protection. Many ancient marriages began with agreements that were publicly acknowledged long before the couple lived together. These early stages were not informal promises. They were serious commitments witnessed by elders, neighbors, or extended family. Yet even after these acknowledgments, daily life often continued almost unchanged. The couple remained in their original households. Responsibilities were not yet fully transferred. This liminal period could feel unresolved to modern observers, but to ancient people it served a critical function. It allowed the future to be tested without collapse. Ancient societies understood that people behaved differently under pressure than in ceremony. A single dramatic wedding could hide problems. Time exposed them. Delays allowed families to observe behavior, compatibility, discipline, and reliability in ordinary conditions rather than festive ones. This was not about romance. It was about function. Marriage was expected to work every day, not just look convincing once. Because of this, ancient weddings often felt incomplete by design. Certain rituals were performed, but others were deliberately postponed. Objects that symbolized full integration were withheld. Clothing that marked final status was not yet worn. The absence was intentional. Everyone involved understood that the marriage was real, but not yet finished. Completion had to be earned through time and stability. This sense of incompletion created a controlled tension. The bride or groom existed in an in-between state, no longer fully belonging to their former household, but not yet fully absorbed into the new one. Ancient societies recognized this state as powerful but fragile. It demanded structure. Without clear boundaries, uncertainty could turn into conflict. Ritual delay created those boundaries. Another strange feature of these extended wedding traditions was the way celebration itself was postponed. In many cases, feasting and public joy were restrained or delayed until later stages of marriage. This inversion feels deeply unnatural to modern sensibilities, where celebration marks the beginning. Ancient societies reversed the order. Joy followed proof. Only after the transition had demonstrated stability did full celebration occur. This reflected a broader worldview. Pleasure was not denied, but it was conditional. Survival came first. Satisfaction came after. Weddings mirrored everyday life rather than escaping from it. Time also played a crucial role in reshaping identity. Ancient people did not believe that a person could simply decide to become someone else overnight. Identity was reinforced by habit, environment, and routine. Changing it required repetition. By extending marriage across weeks, months, or seasons, societies allowed new roles to sink in gradually. The person who entered the process was not the same person who emerged at the end, but the change happened without shock. This gradual transformation was especially important for brides, whose daily lives often changed dramatically. Immediate relocation, new authority structures, and unfamiliar expectations could overwhelm a person if imposed suddenly. Delay softened the transition. It allowed learning, adjustment, and observation. This was not kindness in the modern emotional sense. It was pragmatism. Ancient weddings also used time to manage social memory. A single event could be forgotten or reinterpreted. A long process could not. Repeated rituals, reaffirmed agreements, and staged transitions anchored the marriage firmly in communal awareness. Everyone remembered not just that the wedding happened, but how it unfolded. Memory was reinforced through duration. This mattered deeply in societies without written records. Marriage had to be undeniable. Time made denial difficult. Another unfamiliar aspect was the lack of a fixed endpoint. Some ancient marriages did not have a clearly defined moment when everything became final. Completion depended on conditions, successful harvests, household readiness, community approval, or the judgment of elders. This flexibility allowed marriages to adapt to unpredictable realities like illness, scarcity, or migration. Modern audiences often interpret this as uncertainty or weakness. In reality, it was resilience. Fixed deadlines make systems brittle. Flexible timelines absorb shock. Delay also functioned as a social safety mechanism. If something went wrong early, the consequences were limited. The marriage could be adjusted, renegotiated, or quietly dissolved before full integration caused wider disruption. Ancient societies were not naive. They knew that not every arrangement would succeed. Delay created room for correction without public collapse. This is one of the hardest ideas for modern viewers to accept. Ancient weddings were not designed to guarantee happiness. They were designed to minimize damage. Another strange tradition tied to time was restricted interaction during the early stages of marriage. Even after public acknowledgement, the couple might not spend significant time together unsupervised. This was not cruelty. It prevented premature attachment that could complicate necessary adjustment or correction. Emotional bonds were treated carefully because they could interfere with social clarity. Attachment was expected to grow within structure, not ahead of it. Ancient societies were deeply aware of how powerful emotional commitment could be. They respected it by managing its timing rather than encouraging it immediately. Seasonal rhythms often shaped these extended weddings. Certain stages were aligned with agricultural cycles, weather conditions, or communal schedules. Marriage was not isolated from the rest of life. It was woven into it. This made the process feel slower, but also more stable. The union moved at the same pace as survival itself. Time also acted as a filter. Those who were impatient, impulsive, or unwilling to submit to structure revealed themselves quickly. Endurance was valued more than intensity. A person who could sustain commitment over time was seen as reliable. This emphasis on endurance explains why ancient wedding traditions often feel emotionally restrained. Excitement was not distrusted, but it was insufficient. Stability required consistency. Modern weddings compress meaning into spectacle. Ancient weddings distributed meaning across duration. Perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of these traditions is that ancient people did not experience them as endless waiting. Life itself moved more slowly. Decisions unfolded over seasons rather than hours. Waiting was not absence. It was part of participation. Marriage fit naturally into this rhythm. It did not interrupt life. It extended it. By stretching weddings across time, ancient societies ensured that marriage became part of daily reality rather than a separate event. The transition was absorbed into routine, not imposed from outside it. This made the new structure feel inevitable rather than forced. When modern viewers encounter these traditions, they often feel frustration. They want resolution. Ancient societies wanted integration. Resolution came later, after the system proved it could hold. These long, staged weddings reveal a world that understood how fragile social order was. Marriage was not treated as a private milestone, but as shared architecture. Architecture requires patience. The strangeness we feel today comes from living in a world that values speed, clarity, and emotional immediacy. Ancient weddings were built for a world that valued survival, memory, and gradual change. Marriage did not begin with certainty. Certainty was built. And this slow construction of certainty was one of the most powerful and most alien features of ancient wedding traditions. One of the most misunderstood aspects of ancient wedding traditions is the deliberate use of disorder, inversion, and controlled confusion. To a modern audience, weddings are supposed to represent clarity. Two people unite, roles are defined, happiness is affirmed, and order is reinforced. Ancient societies often believed the opposite. They understood that moments of transition were inherently unstable, and instead of pretending stability already existed, they exposed that instability openly and then reshaped it. Marriage was not simply the joining of two individuals. It was a structural change that affected families, labor systems, inheritance, alliances, and future generations. Ancient people knew from experience that such changes could not happen cleanly. Old roles did not disappear instantly. New ones did not form automatically. Between the two existed a dangerous space where identity, authority, and expectation were uncertain. Ancient wedding rituals deliberately entered this space rather than avoiding it. This is why many ancient weddings feel chaotic or illogical when viewed today. That chaos was intentional. It was not meant to be efficient or pleasing. It was meant to break normal patterns of behavior, forcing participants to release their usual assumptions before accepting new ones. In many ancient cultures, weddings temporarily reversed social hierarchies. People who normally held authority stepped back, while those who usually obeyed were given voice or visibility. Elders might remain silent while younger participants spoke. Figures of respect might be treated casually. These inversions were brief, but powerful. They reminded everyone that authority was not natural or permanent. It was assigned, structured, and maintained by collective agreement. By temporarily removing familiar hierarchies, ancient societies weakened attachment to the old order. This made it easier to install the new one. When hierarchy returned after the wedding, it felt intentional rather than assumed. Stability was restored consciously, not automatically. Ancient people understood something modern societies often forget. Order is strongest when people remember that it can disappear. Weddings created that reminder. Another strange tradition involved intentional confusion of sequence. Actions did not always follow a logical order. Ritual steps might repeat, reverse, or pause unexpectedly. This disrupted participants' sense of control. No one could predict what came next. The ritual itself became the authority, not any individual within it. This loss of predictability served an important psychological function. It prevented premature confidence. No one could rush ahead mentally or emotionally. Everyone had to remain present, attentive, and submissive to the process. Marriage demanded patience and endurance, and the ritual enforced those qualities. Some ancient weddings used symbolic deception, where participants were led to expect one outcome and then encountered another. Objects might be hidden and revealed. Directions might change. These moments were unsettling, but meaningful. They reflected the reality that marriage itself was unpredictable. Ancient societies did not promise certainty. They promised structure within uncertainty. This honesty is one reason ancient wedding traditions feel harsh today. Modern ceremonies often protect participants from discomfort. Ancient ceremonies exposed it deliberately. Another unsettling element was the use of controlled ridicule and laughter. At specific moments, observers were allowed or encouraged to laugh. This laughter was not cruel. It was ritualized. Its purpose was to dissolve personal pride and tension. Marriage reduced individual centrality. Laughter reminded participants that no one entered marriage untouched by humility. In societies where reputation and dignity were vital, this temporary reduction of status acted as a social equalizer. Everyone, regardless of background, passed through the same ritual vulnerability. Once the wedding ended, dignity returned, but now within a new structure. Ancient societies recognized that pride could obstruct adaptation. Weddings softened pride before installing responsibility. Some traditions involved symbolic wandering, where the couple was led through multiple spaces without clear direction. This wandering represented uncertainty. Life after marriage was not fully known. Only at the end were the couple guided firmly to a final place, signaling resolution. The message was subtle but clear. Confusion is temporary, but commitment is permanent. These movements were choreographed carefully. They were not random acts. Every pause, turn, and delay carried meaning understood by the community, even if not articulated explicitly. Ancient weddings also included moments of temporary rule suspension. Certain behaviors normally discouraged were allowed briefly. This release functioned as a pressure valve. Social systems that never allow release eventually fracture. Ancient societies understood this intuitively. By permitting limited disorder within ritual boundaries, they strengthened long-term order. Once the wedding ended, normal rules returned, but with renewed acceptance. People were more willing to submit to structure after experiencing controlled freedom. Another feature that feels strange today is the presence of ambiguous symbolism. Not every gesture or object was explained openly. Participants trusted the ritual because it came from tradition, not because they understood every detail. This trust reinforced communal authority. The ritual did not belong to individuals. It belonged to the society. Modern culture demands explanation. Ancient culture demanded participation. This ambiguity also protected the ritual from challenge. When meaning is partially hidden, it becomes harder to dispute. Authority rests not on logic, but on continuity. Some ancient weddings included mock authority figures who exaggerated rules or behaviors to the point of absurdity. This was not disrespect. It clarified boundaries. By parodying authority briefly, societies reinforced respect for real authority afterward. Contrast strengthened legitimacy. Ancient societies were not naive about power. They understood that unquestioned power breeds resentment. Ritual satire relieved that tension. Another aspect of ritual disorder was deliberate interruption. Just as emotional intensity built, the ritual paused. Participants waited. This prevented emotional overwhelm and reinforced patience. Marriage was not about emotional climax. It was about endurance. Ancient weddings flattened emotional extremes intentionally. Stability required calm more than excitement. These traditions also served an important function in conflict management. Weddings brought together families with complex histories and potential tension. Controlled disorder allowed awkwardness, laughter, and release to occur safely. Once the wedding concluded, those tensions had been diffused rather than suppressed. This communal therapy aspect is often overlooked by modern observers. Perhaps the most important thing to understand is that ancient societies did not see disorder as the opposite of order. They saw it as a tool for renewing order. By entering controlled chaos together, participants emerged into a shared clarity. Marriage did not begin with certainty. Certainty was constructed through experience. Modern weddings often aim to display perfection. Ancient weddings aim to produce resilience. They tested patience, obedience, humility, and endurance before granting full social recognition. This difference explains why ancient wedding traditions feel uncomfortable today. They refuse to reassure. They challenge before confirming. By the time an ancient wedding ended, participants had experienced uncertainty and survived it together. That shared survival created legitimacy. The new marriage was not just declared, it was proven. In a world where life itself was unstable, this approach made sense. Marriage did not promise ease. It promised structure strong enough to endure difficulty. And that is why ancient weddings often began in disorder, confusion, and inversion, so that when order finally returned, it returned stronger than before. While many ancient wedding traditions focused on transition, endurance, and social order, some of the strangest and most emotionally intense customs centered on separation, loss, and controlled grief. To modern audiences, weddings are framed as beginnings filled with joy. In the ancient world, they were also endings. Something was being lost permanently, and ancient societies believed that pretending otherwise was dishonest and dangerous. Because of this, many wedding rituals deliberately made space for sadness, tension, and even mourning. Ancient people did not believe that major life changes should feel easy. They believed that change carried a cost, and that cost had to be acknowledged openly. Marriage removed a person, usually a woman, from one household and placed her into another. This was not just a change of residence. It was a rupture of daily relationships, routines, and authority structures. Ignoring that rupture would have created emotional instability later. So ancient societies confronted it directly. This is one of the most difficult ideas for modern viewers to accept. Ancient weddings often included ritualized sorrow. In many cultures, the period leading up to the wedding involved deliberate emotional distancing. The bride might spend extended time with her birth family, engaging in final shared activities that emphasized separation rather than continuity. These moments were not casual. They were framed as last occurrences of familiar roles. The purpose was not to create despair, but to prepare emotionally for irreversible change. Ancient societies understood that unacknowledged loss does not disappear. It resurfaces later as resentment, confusion, or instability. Weddings gave loss a voice so it would not undermine the marriage afterward. Another unsettling tradition involved controlled expressions of grief. In some cultures, formal displays of sadness were expected. These displays were not spontaneous outbursts. They followed social rules. There were appropriate times, places, and participants. By containing grief within ritual boundaries, societies prevented it from spilling into daily life uncontrollably. This controlled grief served an important psychological function. It allowed individuals to release attachment while reinforcing acceptance. Once grief had been expressed publicly, it was easier to move forward without lingering ambiguity. Ancient people were not uncomfortable with mixed emotions. They did not require weddings to feel purely positive. They accepted that joy and loss could coexist. Another strange custom was the temporary elevation of the birth family's authority during certain stages of the wedding. Even as the transfer approached, the bride's original household might assert its role strongly one last time. This was not resistance to the marriage. It was acknowledgement that authority was being relinquished, not erased. Letting go mattered as much as taking hold. Some traditions emphasized this through symbolic acts of release. Objects associated with childhood or previous identity might be handled, moved, or set aside. These acts marked the end of one phase of life. The individual was reminded, gently but clearly, that return was not expected. Ancient societies believed clarity reduced pain. Ambiguous loss caused deeper wounds. Another emotionally intense practice involved deliberate isolation before the wedding's final stages. The bride might be separated from both families temporarily, supervised by elders or attendants. This isolation was not punishment. It symbolized the space between identities. Alone but protected, the individual stood at the threshold of transformation. This isolation also reduced emotional dependence. By removing familiar comfort briefly, ancient societies prepared the individual to adapt to a new environment without collapse. Ancient people were deeply aware of the power of emotional bonds. They respected those bonds enough to manage them carefully rather than ignoring them. Some weddings included ritual silence at key moments. Silence created emotional weight. It forced participants to confront the seriousness of what was happening. Noise belonged to celebration. Silence belonged to transition. Ancient rituals used both intentionally. Another strange element was the absence of reassurance. Modern weddings are filled with affirmations and promises of happiness. Ancient weddings often avoided such language. They did not promise ease. They promised structure. Reassurance was considered fragile. Structure was considered reliable. This difference explains why ancient wedding rituals can feel emotionally cold today. They were not designed to comfort feelings. They were designed to stabilize lives. Separation rituals also served the wider community. They reminded families that marriage altered social networks. One household lost daily access to a member. Another gained responsibility. This shift had to be acknowledged collectively, so expectations adjusted accordingly. Ancient weddings did not hide the fact that marriage redistributed emotional labor. Someone who had once cared for parents or siblings would now prioritize a new household. This reordering was painful. Ritual gave that pain form. Another unusual tradition involved delayed reunion. Even after public ceremonies, the bride might not immediately integrate fully into her new household. This delay allowed grief to settle before new routines began. Emotional adjustment was not rushed. Ancient societies understood that unresolved grief weakened commitment. Time allowed emotions to reorganize. Some cultures also used symbolic barriers, physical or social, to mark separation. Doors were closed. Paths were blocked. These gestures communicated finality. They were not meant to be cruel. They were meant to prevent false hope. False hope destabilized social order. Modern audiences often interpret these customs as oppressive or unnecessary, but ancient people saw them as honest acknowledgments of reality. Marriage involved loss. Ignoring that loss did not make it disappear. Ancient societies also recognized that parents experienced loss during weddings. Their role changed. Authority shifted. Emotional dependence altered. Ritual addressed this as well. Certain actions allowed parents to express release publicly, reducing later interference. This protected the new marriage from external pressure. Another emotionally complex element was the use of memory reinforcement. Ancient weddings often included references to the past, not to romanticize it, but to close it. By naming what was ending, societies prevented it from lingering unspoken. Perhaps the most striking difference between ancient and modern weddings is that ancient rituals did not try to protect participants from emotional difficulty. They believed difficulty was part of transformation. Avoiding it weakened the outcome. Modern culture often treats discomfort as failure. Ancient culture treated it as preparation. By confronting loss openly, ancient weddings strengthened commitment. Once grief had been acknowledged, the new structure felt legitimate rather than forced. The individual did not carry unresolved attachment into the marriage. This does not mean ancient people felt less deeply. It means they structured emotion deliberately. The strangeness we feel today comes from living in a culture that expects weddings to be emotionally one-sided. Ancient weddings accepted emotional complexity as normal. Marriage was not framed as escape from the past. It was framed as departure from it. And departures, when taken seriously, require acknowledgement of what is left behind. One of the most surprising realities of ancient wedding traditions is that marriage did not belong to the couple alone. In many ancient societies, a wedding was understood as a collective event with collective consequences. It reorganized labor, inheritance, alliances, and future obligations across an entire community. Because of this, ancient weddings often included customs that placed the weight of responsibility not on two individuals, but on everyone around them. To modern audiences, accustomed to seeing marriage as private, this feels deeply strange. Ancient people lived in systems where survival depended on cooperation. Households were not isolated units. They were part of networks that shared resources, labor, and protection. When a marriage occurred, those networks shifted. A new connection was formed. Old ones weakened. Responsibilities moved. These changes could not be managed quietly or individually. They had to be acknowledged and enforced collectively. This is why ancient weddings often involved the entire community, not just invited guests. Attendance was not optional. Being present meant accepting responsibility for recognizing and supporting the new social arrangement. Absence could signal refusal or doubt. Presence signaled agreement. Ancient societies believed that what was not witnessed did not fully exist. One of the strangest traditions tied to this belief was the idea that the community itself validated the marriage, not the couple. A union was considered incomplete until it had been publicly seen, discussed, and absorbed into communal memory. The ritual did not just announce a marriage. It created a shared understanding that could not easily be challenged later. In this context, weddings functioned as social contracts written into memory rather than paper. Community participation took many forms. In some cultures, neighbors actively took part in rituals, guiding the couple, providing objects, repeating phrases, or marking transitions through movement or sound. These actions were not symbolic gestures of support. They were mechanisms of enforcement. By participating, individuals bound themselves to the reality of the marriage. Once you helped create it, you were obligated to respect it. Another unfamiliar custom was the distribution of responsibility during the wedding itself. Different members of the community were assigned specific roles: witnesses, guides, attendants, observers. These roles created layers of accountability. No single person held complete authority over the process. Authority was dispersed intentionally. This dispersal reduced conflict. If responsibility was shared, blame was shared as well. The marriage belonged to everyone, not just the families involved. Ancient weddings also emphasized public repetition. Key moments were repeated aloud, sometimes by multiple voices. Names, roles, and obligations were spoken again and again. This repetition embedded the marriage into collective memory. Forgetting became difficult. Memory was infrastructure. Another strange aspect was the way community opinion could shape the pace or structure of the wedding. If concerns existed about readiness, resources, or alignment, the process could slow. Ritual stages could be delayed. This was not seen as interference. It was seen as protection. Ancient societies trusted communal judgment more than individual intention. This trust extended beyond the wedding day. Community members monitored the marriage afterward. They noticed behavior, adaptation, and fulfillment of roles. Support and correction came from many directions, not just from within the household. Marriage was a public commitment with public consequences. This level of involvement feels intrusive to modern audiences, but ancient people saw it as stabilizing. Isolation was dangerous. Visibility created safety. Another unusual tradition involved shared celebration with shared obligation. Feasts were not simply entertainment. Contributing food, labor, or space meant investing in the marriage's success. The more people contributed, the stronger the bond between the marriage and the community. Celebration created obligation. Ancient weddings also used collective movement to reinforce belonging. Processions through streets, pauses at communal spaces, and transitions marked by crowd participation turned the marriage into a citywide event. The couple passed through shared space to signal that their union affected everyone. Marriage altered the map of social life. Another unfamiliar element was the absence of privacy. Many stages of ancient weddings occurred in full view of others. Privacy was not valued during transition. Privacy belonged to stable life, not change. Openness prevented doubt and rumor. Ancient societies believed secrecy weakened legitimacy. Community participation also functioned as emotional regulation. Intense personal feelings were absorbed by collective presence. No one faced the transition alone. Grief, excitement, and uncertainty were shared, diffused, and normalized. This prevented emotional extremes from destabilizing the new structure. Another strange practice was communal instruction. Advice was not given privately. Expectations were spoken aloud by elders or respected figures. This public instruction clarified roles and prevented misunderstandings. Everyone heard the same message. Once expectations were public, enforcement became collective. Ancient weddings also included symbolic gestures of acceptance from the community. These might be subtle, a shared action, a synchronized movement, a collective sound. The symbolism mattered less than the unity. Acceptance was not assumed. It was demonstrated. Without acceptance, marriage remained fragile. It is important to understand that ancient communities did not see this involvement as ownership over the couple. They saw it as shared responsibility. If the marriage failed, consequences spread. Children lacked support. Labor networks weakened. Conflict increased. Everyone had a stake. Modern societies distribute these risks across institutions. Ancient societies distributed them across people. This explains why ancient weddings often feel overwhelming or excessive. They carried the weight of collective survival. They were not moments of individual expression. They were mechanisms of social maintenance. Ancient people did not ask whether a wedding made the couple happy. They asked whether it made the community stronger. This does not mean individual feelings were irrelevant. It means they were not central. Centrality belonged to continuity. Another unfamiliar element was the expectation of intervention. If problems arose later, community members felt entitled to step in. The wedding had granted them that right. They had witnessed the commitment and therefore shared authority over its maintenance. Modern audiences often interpret this as control. Ancient people interpreted it as care. The idea that marriage belonged to the community explains many otherwise puzzling traditions. Why so many witnesses? Why so much repetition? Why so little privacy? Because legitimacy depended on shared knowledge. When everyone knew, no one could deny. Perhaps the strangest thing of all is that ancient people found comfort in this system. Being surrounded, observed, and supported reduced anxiety. You were not alone in managing life's most significant change. Modern culture values independence. Ancient culture valued interdependence. Understanding this difference helps us see ancient wedding traditions not as oppressive or chaotic, but as carefully designed systems for managing risk in a fragile world. Marriage was not a personal milestone. It was a social event with long-term consequences for many lives. And because of that, ancient weddings did not ask for quiet approval. They demanded collective participation. One of the deepest reasons ancient wedding traditions feel so strange today is that marriage was fundamentally an economic institution. Long before it was framed as a romantic bond, marriage existed to organize labor, resources, and long-term survival. This reality shaped wedding rituals in ways that modern audiences often find uncomfortable, transactional, or even shocking. Yet without these customs, ancient societies could not have functioned. In the ancient world, survival depended on work done every single day. Farming, food preparation, construction, craft production, animal care, storage, and protection. These tasks were rarely handled by individuals alone. They required households, coordinated units of labor with clear roles. Marriage was the primary mechanism through which these units were created, expanded, or reinforced. Because of this, Ancient weddings openly addressed economics rather than hiding it behind symbolism. What modern weddings often imply quietly, ancient weddings declared publicly and explicitly. One of the strangest aspects of ancient weddings was how openly they acknowledged labor transfer. Marriage was not only the union of two people, it was the reassignment of work capacity. When someone married, especially a woman, her daily labor moved from one household to another. Cooking, production, caregiving, and management followed her. This was not abstract. It had immediate consequences for survival. Ancient societies could not afford to ignore this shift. So weddings included rituals that made labor transfer visible. Tasks associated with the bride's skills might be demonstrated, referenced, or symbolically handed over. These actions were not degrading. They were clarifying. Everyone involved needed to understand who was now responsible for what. Clarity prevented resentment. Another unsettling custom involved long-term obligation signaling. Ancient weddings often included references not just to present arrangements, but to future responsibility. Marriage was expected to last not because of emotion, but because breaking it created economic instability. Ritual language emphasized endurance, duty, and continuity. These were not romantic promises. They were survival commitments. Some ancient weddings included rituals that symbolized investment. Objects were exchanged not as gifts of affection, but as markers of contribution. Tools, livestock symbols, household items, or stored goods represented readiness to support a new unit. These exchanges were not about wealth display. They were about proof of capacity. A household that could not support a new member was vulnerable. Weddings exposed that reality rather than hiding it. Another strange tradition involved delayed economic integration. Even after marriage was publicly acknowledged, full resource sharing might be postponed. This was not distrust. It was caution. Gradual integration allowed households to adjust without collapse. Sudden economic merging could overwhelm systems that operated on narrow margins. Ancient societies favored slow integration over sudden unity. Some wedding rituals emphasized future productivity rather than present comfort. The language used in ceremonies often focused on work, growth, and continuity. These themes can feel cold today, but they reflected real priorities. A marriage that could not sustain itself economically threatened everyone connected to it. Ancient people did not assume prosperity. They planned for scarcity. Another unfamiliar practice was the community's role in economic accountability. Because marriages affected labor networks, neighbors and relatives monitored how the new household functioned. If obligations were not met, intervention followed. This oversight was not optional. It was part of the marriage contract. In modern societies, institutions absorbed these risks. In ancient societies, people did. Weddings also clarified inheritance pathways. Even before children existed, rituals established future claims. Who would inherit what was not left vague? Vagueness caused conflict. Conflict weakened survival networks. Ritual made inheritance expectations visible early. This foresight can feel excessive today. In ancient contexts, it was essential. Another strange feature was the lack of emphasis on personal fulfillment. Ancient weddings did not ask whether marriage made individuals happy. They asked whether it made the system stronger. Happiness was not ignored, but it was secondary. A stable household created the conditions in which contentment might later develop. Ancient societies prioritized outcomes over feelings. Economic symbolism also extended to time commitment. Marriage rituals emphasized long duration rather than emotional intensity. Endurance mattered more than passion. A couple that could sustain routine labor together was valued more than one that displayed excitement. This perspective challenges modern assumptions, but it reflects ancient reality. Survival rewarded consistency, not intensity. Another unsettling custom was the expectation that marriage would limit individual choice. Personal preference mattered less than household function. Weddings made this limitation visible rather than pretending otherwise. Ritual acknowledged loss of autonomy as part of stability. Ancient people did not view autonomy as the highest good. They viewed continuity as the highest good. Some wedding traditions symbolized risk sharing. Marriage redistributed vulnerability. If one person fell ill or failed, the household absorbed the impact. Ritual language often emphasized shared burden rather than shared pleasure. This was honest. Marriage increased responsibility as much as security. Modern weddings often promise support. Ancient weddings demanded it. Another strange aspect was the community's expectation of productivity after marriage. The wedding marked the beginning of contribution, not rest. Celebration was brief. Work resumed quickly. This was not cruelty. It reflected the reality that survival did not pause for ritual. Marriage marked readiness for responsibility. Ancient wedding rituals also reinforced economic hierarchy. They did not pretend all unions were equal. Some marriages brought greater resources or influence. Rituals acknowledged this openly. Hiding inequality was considered dangerous. Visibility allowed expectations to align. Modern discomfort with this honesty comes from projecting modern ideals backward. Another unfamiliar practice was long-term reciprocity. Marriage created obligations that extended far beyond the couple. Families supported each other during hardship. These expectations were embedded in wedding rituals, so they could not be forgotten. Marriage was a network-building mechanism. Ancient people did not romanticize poverty. They planned around it. Weddings reflected that planning. Perhaps the most important thing to understand is that ancient societies did not separate economics from emotion because they could not afford to. Emotional bonds alone could not feed households or protect children. Economic structure created the space in which emotion could exist. This does not mean ancient people felt less. It means they organized feeling around survival. When modern audiences encounter these traditions, they often label them transactional or unloving. But this interpretation misunderstands the environment. In a fragile world, honesty was a form of care. Ancient wedding traditions confronted reality directly. They acknowledged that marriage required work, sacrifice, and cooperation. Ritual did not hide this. It prepared people for it. Marriage was not sold as escape. It was presented as responsibility. And responsibility, when shared openly and structured carefully, created stability that allowed societies to endure for centuries. This is why ancient wedding traditions can feel unsettling today. They refuse to flatter individual desire. They prioritize collective survival. When all the unusual, uncomfortable, and often unsettling elements of ancient wedding traditions are examined together, a clear logic begins to emerge. These traditions were not random, exaggerated, or symbolic in the modern decorative sense. They were practical systems designed for stability in a fragile world. Ancient weddings were not meant to express personal emotion or celebrate individuality. They were meant to lock a social transformation into place so firmly that it could not easily unravel. This is the central reason they feel so strange today. In the ancient world, marriage was one of the most consequential decisions a community could make. It reorganized labor, residence, inheritance, alliance, responsibility, and future security. It determined who would eat together, who would work together, who would protect whom, and who would care for children and elders. When marriage succeeded, it strengthened households and communities. When it failed, the consequences extended far beyond emotional disappointment. Failure could lead to poverty, conflict, isolation, or long-term instability that affected many people at once. Because the consequences were so serious, ancient societies did not trust simplicity. They did not believe that a brief, pleasant ceremony could carry enough weight to stabilize such a profound change. Instead, they constructed weddings that were deliberately heavy with obligation, visibility, endurance, and memory. The length, difficulty, and intensity of the rituals were not excess. They were structural reinforcement. Ancient people understood something that modern societies often overlook. Humans reinterpret the past. They forget details. They reshape memories to suit present needs. A marriage that could be mentally revised or emotionally dismissed later was a weak marriage. Ancient wedding traditions were designed to resist reinterpretation. They made the transition so demanding, so witnessed, and so deeply embedded in routine that denial became socially and psychologically difficult. This is why ancient weddings required time. Time allowed transformation to sink in. Time exposed doubt. Time forced adjustment. A change that unfolds slowly becomes real in a way that sudden declarations do not. Ancient societies trusted time more than excitement. Because time revealed whether a structure could hold. They also trusted cost. Not cost in a monetary sense alone, but cost in effort, endurance, patience, and submission to process. A marriage that required nothing was considered fragile. A marriage that demanded something from everyone involved was harder to abandon. Cost created commitment. Modern observers often interpret ancient wedding discomfort as cruelty or oppression, but this misunderstands the environment in which these traditions developed. Ancient societies were not trying to make people suffer. They were trying to prevent collapse later. Discomfort at the beginning was preferable to disaster afterward. Ritualized difficulty was a form of risk management. Ancient weddings also refused to hide loss. Marriage was not only a gain, it was also a separation. People left familiar homes, routines, and authority structures behind. Ignoring that loss would not make it disappear. It would only resurface later as resentment or instability. By acknowledging loss openly, ancient rituals allowed people to process it within controlled boundaries rather than letting it undermine the marriage from within. This honesty about loss is one of the most jarring differences between ancient and modern weddings. Modern ceremonies emphasize optimism and reassurance. Ancient ceremonies emphasized realism. They did not promise happiness. They promised structure. Structure was considered more reliable than emotion. Another key difference lies in how ancient societies understood the individual. Modern culture places the individual at the center of marriage. Ancient culture placed the structure at the center. Individuals were expected to adapt to marriage, not the other way around. This does not mean ancient people lacked feelings or personal bonds. It means those bonds were not considered strong enough on their own to sustain a household under pressure. Marriage was treated as infrastructure. Infrastructure does not exist to express personality. It exists to carry weight. Because marriage was infrastructure, it belonged to the community as much as to the couple. Witnesses were not passive observers. They were enforcers of memory. Repetition, public participation, and collective involvement ensured that marriage could not be quietly redefined later. Everyone knew what had happened. Everyone remembered how it happened. That shared memory created legitimacy. Privacy, which modern societies prize, was considered dangerous during transformation. Visibility protected stability. Once the transition was complete, privacy could return. But during the change itself, openness was essential. Ancient wedding traditions also reveal a fundamentally different relationship to emotion. Ancient societies did not treat emotion as the foundation of commitment. Emotion was understood to fluctuate. Structure endured. Rituals were designed to stabilize behavior regardless of mood. This approach can feel cold today, but it reflects an environment where survival depended on reliability rather than fulfillment. The heavy emphasis on endurance, patience, and submission to process was not about domination. It was about testing readiness. A person who could endure a demanding ritual without collapsing was considered more likely to endure the demands of daily life afterward. Weddings did not pretend marriage would be easy. They prepared people for difficulty. Modern weddings often attempt to shield participants from discomfort. Ancient weddings did the opposite. They introduced controlled difficulty so that future difficulty would not feel unexpected or destabilizing. This difference alone explains much of the strangeness we perceive. Economic transparency further reinforces this logic. Ancient societies could not afford to separate love from labor. Marriage reorganized work, resources, and survival strategies. Rituals addressed this openly because pretending otherwise created confusion. Modern discomfort with this openness reflects modern economic distance, not ancient ignorance. Ancient weddings did not romanticize poverty or struggle. They acknowledged them and planned around them. The goal was not ideal happiness. The goal was endurance. When all of these elements are considered together, ancient wedding traditions stop appearing irrational. They form a coherent system designed to produce long-term stability in an uncertain world. Every delay, every public action, every uncomfortable moment, and every collective ritual served to anchor marriage deeply into social reality. The strangeness we feel today comes from living in a world where many of the risks ancient societies faced have been outsourced to institutions, technologies, and systems. Modern marriage exists within a safety net. Ancient marriage did not. Ritual replaced insurance. Community replaced contracts. Memory replaced documentation. Ancient weddings were not celebrations of identity. They were transformations of responsibility. They did not ask who you were. They asked whether you could endure what you were becoming. In that context, their intensity makes sense. Ancient wedding traditions were not excessive. They were precise responses to real constraints. They were shaped by scarcity, vulnerability, and the constant need for cooperation. They were not designed to be beautiful. They were designed to work. And that is why they feel so unfamiliar today. They remind us of a world where marriage was not an expression of desire, but a decision about survival, where commitment was built through structure rather than emotion, and where stability mattered more than comfort. Once we understand that, the strangeness disappears. What remains is a clear, uncompromising logic shaped by the realities of ancient life. When we look back at ancient wedding traditions, what initially feels strange, uncomfortable, or even shocking slowly begins to make sense. These customs were not designed to impress guests or celebrate emotion in the modern sense. They were built for a world where survival was uncertain, where communities depended on stability, and where marriage carried consequences far beyond two individuals. Ancient weddings were serious because life was serious. They acknowledged loss as well as gain, obligation as well as connection, and endurance as well as hope. Rituals were long, demanding, public, and sometimes uncomfortable because they needed to reshape behavior, not just mark a moment. Marriage was not treated as a feeling, but as a structure that had to hold under pressure. What feels excessive to us today was, for ancient societies, a form of protection. By involving the community, stretching the process over time, confronting difficulty openly, and embedding marriage deeply into memory and routine, these traditions reduced uncertainty and strengthened social bonds. They did not promise happiness. They promised continuity. Modern weddings tell us who we are. Ancient weddings prepared people for how they would live. Understanding this difference allows us to see ancient traditions not as irrational or cruel, but as carefully designed responses to a fragile world. They reveal how deeply marriage was tied to survival, cooperation, and shared responsibility. Thank you for staying with this long journey through the strange but meaningful world of ancient wedding traditions. If you enjoyed this deep, calm exploration of history, like the video, subscribe for more long-form history, and leave a comment sharing which ancient tradition surprised you the most. Thank you for listening.